Good morning to you all just joining. We will kick off shortly. We'll let the time tick over to 10 o'clock. But in the meantime, we're just going to put up a short quiz just on a couple of questions. If you can answer these while you wait, that'd be great. And then we'll get into today's content. Hi there, Christina. Okay, so we've launched a quiz on the screen. If we just flick onto the next page, there's some questions on some interesting facts. So the three questions: how many shipping containers are moved each year? How many containers are lost at sea each year? And how many ships sink in the ocean every year? So if you could answer those on the quiz, we'll close that shortly, and then we'll go through some of the answers. Right, we're just ticking up nicely with the attendees. For the ones that have just joined, if you'd like to just complete the quiz on the three questions that are on the screen, and then we'll start to get into today's content. Okay, if we can close that quiz now, then we can view the results. So, question one, how many shipping containers are moved each year? So, if we'd like to flick on, we have 14% that has said 250 million, which is the correct answer. So, well done to all of you guys. And then 30% with 275 and 56 with 300 million. Moving on to the second question, how many containers are lost at sea each year? How many containers are lost at sea each year? The answer is 1,500, and well done to the 41% of you that got that one right. And then finally, how many ships sink in the ocean every year? So the answer here is 24 plus. So there's more than 24 that will sink each year, unfortunately. So everyone should be able to see those answers. That's great. Thank you for participating in that. But to start today, I'd just like to welcome you all to today's session. My name's David Fleming. I'm the Regional Sales Operations and Marketing Manager here in Northwest Europe for Expeditors. And I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. If we could just move on a slide or two, Christina, if that's okay. So yes, I'd like to welcome you all to today's Incoterms session. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping. We welcome questions from anyone, and participation is encouraged. Please make sure that you use the Q&A box. On Zoom, you have a couple of options. So you have a Q&A box and you have a chat box. The chat box is specifically there to, if you have any technical issues, so the sound isn't working or you can't see the content. But if you've got questions around the content of today's session, i.e. Incoterms, please pop them in the Q&A box, and these will be handled sort of throughout the session. With your questions, just please make sure they avoid personal information, and the more specific that you are with your question, it makes it harder for us to answer in the moment. But if you have more specific questions, we can take those away after the session. And just one final thing, the material that we present today is trademark copyright. And Expeditors have a license to present said material, but we don't have the option to share the material in the presentation form, and we can't record the session either. So we just move on one more slide. So we'll have 75 minutes of content, and as I mentioned, the Q&A will be handled during the session. Your cameras and mics will be turned off at all times. And as I mentioned, the Q&A box is there for you to submit all of your questions. I mentioned the session wasn't being recorded, but you will receive a handout which details a lot of the content and the specifics around the Incoterms after the session, as long as you complete a short survey that will be sent from either myself or Eleanor Roberts, who's helping facilitate this session. And if you want more information about any future webinars, please scan the QR code on the screen. This will also take you to a page where you can sign up for Expeditors Operational Impact. This is time critical content, especially around the situations that are going on in the Middle East at the moment. So they are sending out content on a daily basis just to keep customers updated. So today's session, I'm joined by Ellie Roberts, Sales Operations for Manchester, along with Michael and Bridget. Collectively with myself, we'll monitor the Q&A box and we'll try to answer any questions that do come in. If we do run out of time, or as I've previously mentioned, the questions we can't answer straight away, or we can't give you the exact answer we would like, we'll compile those and make sure we get an answer back to you through your account manager or Expeditors contact. Now on to today's speaker. So Christina Bogart is a regional trainer at Expeditors. She's based out of our Dublin office. She's been with Expeditors for nearly 20 years and holds bachelor's degrees in international trade and economy. Throughout her career, she's worked across export operations, account management, product management, with particular expertise in pharmaceutical and temperature control shipments. This on-hand operation experience and her commercial background gives Christina a strong practical perspective, making her ideally placed to break down Incoterms and explain where the risk and responsibility truly sit. So with that, I would like to hand over to Christina, and I'd like to thank her for taking the time today to present to us all. And to everyone that's joined, thank you for joining, and I hope you find the session informative and useful. And once again, any questions you have, pop them in the Q&A box. If you have any technical issues with the webinar, pop them in the chat box and we will help there. But yeah, thank you. Over to yourself, Christina.
Thank you very much, David. Very much appreciate that. Very welcome, everybody. Let me just say that I'm amazed how many of us gathered here together for the next hour or so to learn about Incoterms. I can look at the number of participants and it keeps growing still, so it's amazing. So thank you very much, and we will do our best to make your time worthwhile. Incoterms, very important topic, more and more so when we deal with international trade. But where exactly Incoterms come from? What is Incoterms exactly? It's an abbreviation of international commercial terms. And if you're in logistics long enough, you probably had your fair share of abbreviations. We just love or COBs or ETAs or SKUs and POs and etc. There's probably loads more. Incoterms was created back in the days with a distinct purpose to reduce ambiguity around international trade, especially around the obligations of the seller and the buyer, and also to address where certain risks and costs transfer from one party to another. Now, you might be wondering, I mean, we conduct business, the same way everywhere. Why is it necessary? You might be right. It might not always be true, though. Different parts of the world, even the way we meet and greet one another, coming from different cultural backgrounds, it differs. And so is how business is conducted in different parts of the world. So when you're involved in international trade, you need to be sure that both your seller, or if you're a buyer, the other party, you're on the same page. And this is where Incoterms come very handy, because if you commit to use a certain Incoterm from this book, then you can be assured that you understand exactly the same thing under obligations. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a history lesson, not too long, just a tiny bit to give you some context. Incoterms is not a new thing. In fact, it was created back in the 1930s. It has gone through a number of revisions over the decades, and recently it was revamped in 2020, which is what this webinar is about. Now, why was it necessary to kind of revise it over time? Well, you may imagine that both the way we trade and also the modes of transport have gone through changes since the 1930s. The way we ship and move goods is not exactly the same today as it was back maybe 80, 90 years ago. To make sure that Incoterms stay relevant, revisions are necessary, and since the 1980s, the revisions have been done typically over a 10-year period, and every 10 years there's a new version coming out. So if they keep going with the current schedule, we can see the next version of Incoterms coming in 2030. Having said that, there's no rule or reason around it, so they could, unless something dramatically changes, they could do it earlier or maybe later. And it's up to the International Chamber of Commerce who issues the Incoterms. So what we're going to do today is we're going to review first Incoterms 2020 in general. We're going to have a look at how it's structured and what it applies to and what it doesn't apply to. And then we're going to have a look at the different terms one by one. For full disclosure, I'd like to point out, and it's very important for you to understand, that we are not here to advise you which Incoterm to use for a shipment or in general. This webinar is designed to explain the meaning of the Incoterms. So the next time you're involved in a conversation or engaging in negotiations around sales of goods, you can engage with more ease and confidence based on the knowledge that you gain from this webinar. So with that in mind, let's have a look at Incoterms 2020. It was published about 6 years ago, and this is the latest version of the Incoterms. There are 11 terms listed in the Incoterms 2020 version. 7 of them apply for all modes of transport, and 4 of them apply for sea and inland waterways only. When we talk about Incoterms, it's very important to understand what it does address and govern and what it does not. We already mentioned that it is basically around the obligations of the buyer and the seller, and it also addresses the transfer of cost and risk between the main stakeholders. However, what it does not do, it does not replace the sales contract. That is very much still an essential when you deal with international business. It does not address the transfer of ownership. So at what point the ownership of the goods transfer from the seller to the buyer, that's what the sales contract is for. Incoterms also do not address payment terms. That is also what is outlined in the sales contract. Incoterms is also not law. It only becomes legally binding if the terms are incorporated into the sales contract. Without that, it has no legal kind of gravity, if you want to say it like that. So these are very important points to understand before you start negotiating and start creating contracts. Now, Incoterms addresses the obligations of the different stakeholders and the transfer of cost and risk based on certain milestones in the supply chain. So in order for us to understand how Incoterms really works, we need to understand first how a typical supply chain works, or what the typical process is. What you see on the screen, if you will be interested in maybe in exploring Incoterms a little bit further, the International Chamber of Commerce has a few publications available in different formats and also in several languages. I think I've seen the Incoterms in Spanish and French as well. probably there's one issued in German as well. You can visit their website, but you can also explore and order the book format from Amazon, and they also have an app. It's not very expensive, but if you are regularly involved in these conversations and negotiations, it's probably a good thing to have the book at hand. Now, as I mentioned, the Incoterms 2020 version replaced the previous version created in 2010. That does not mean that the 2010 version cannot be used anymore. In fact, if you are referring to the 2010 version of a certain Incoterm in your sales contract, then you still can use it. So that's also something that might be relevant to your business. If you are using a certain Incoterms from a previous version and you're very happy with it, there's no need to change it. You can still continue using it as long as you reference it accordingly. The 2020 version brought only a few changes, but they could be impactful for you if you are using certain terms like CIP or CIF, for example. The changes that were made in the 2020 version relates to the type of insurance that the seller has to take out when using these terms. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. The 2020 version requires a higher level of insurance than the previous versions, which means that it is likely more expensive, which means that it's going to have a cost implication on the seller. So if you're using the 2020 version, you better check out the exact terms, because it could mean it could have a financial impact on you as a seller. The other change was that a new Incoterms was introduced, DPU, which we're also going to cover, and another one was retired, DAT. It's no longer listed in the 2020 version. As I mentioned, we're going to have two very distinct groups. One group of the Incoterms applies for all modes of transport. You can use it for air, ocean, road freight, etc. And there's 4 Incoterms in this version that is only applicable for ocean or inland waterways. Now, with that said, let's have a look at that typical supply chain flow. For us to really understand the Incoterms one by one, first we need to understand how goods typically move through the supply chain. So if you're lucky enough to deal with, for example, full truckloads within the EU, and the truck is loaded at your location as a seller, and it doesn't stop until it reaches the delivery place, the consignee, and then it gets offloaded, then you're lucky. There's literally a transport from A to B. There's not a lot of parties involved. However, if you're using different modes of transport or transloading points in your supply chain, then your movement and flow chart might look a little bit more complex, like the one you see on the screen, for example. This is a very simplified version of the typical supply chain. It starts with the manufacturer, the seller, or the shipper. You can call them in different ways. They have slightly different meanings. Typically, before the goods get to the carrier that is going to take the goods and physically move it to another location, there's a couple of steps involved. Like that shipment needs to be brought to the carrier. If you are not within the EU, you will have to do international customs clearance and export clearance. You may need to work with a freight forwarder who will be able to book with the carrier, issue transportation paperwork. The carrier not necessarily will handle the shipment themselves. They call what we have handling agents to do that work for them at ports and airports and depots. So you will have a fair amount of people handling and touching your freight just while it's still at origin. Then the main transportation happens, and the destination, the same repeats again. There's going to be a handling agent offloading your cargo from the vessel, the aircraft, or the main truck. There could be a broker who does your import customs clearance if there is a requirement. There will be a freight forwarder maybe arranging for delivery. And then there's the actual delivery before your consignee is going to see the shipment delivered to them. And then the consignee may or may not have to offload the cargo and put it in their place, warehouse, wherever the goods may need to go to. So there's a lot of moving objects here in the supply chain, right? Now let me ask you a question. Think about that. If you are the seller, you are selling goods. Doesn't really matter what it is. Is it going to be, is it going to make a difference to you whether you are just presenting the goods at your premises, you're not doing anything else, you let the buyer handle everything else, or if you take it upon yourself to maybe deliver it to the carrier at origin, to the port or the airport, or you even arrange transportation to the final destination? Does this going to have an impact on the overall final price of your product? That's the question. Does it make a difference? If you would like to maybe put something in the chat, what do you think? Is it going to have an impact on the product price, depending on where your responsibilities end? Or no, it's not really, it doesn't really matter. I can see a few responses. Yes, 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 the price will change. And you are absolutely correct. Because every single person who's going to touch your goods in this process, well, they're not charity workers. They want to get paid for their services. And if you are engaging their services, you need to build their cost into your product price. So yes, it absolutely will have an impact on the final product price. Now, we don't assume you to know all the Incoterms, but if you're familiar with this, you probably know that X works is the least amount of responsibilities for the seller. All they have to do is to present the goods ready to be picked up. That's where it ends. So if you buy based on X works, that's the cheapest product price that you could get. If you go to CFR, which means that as the seller, you have to arrange for transportation, the main transportation, the destination, you will have to pay for that cost as well. So that's going to be incorporated into your price if you break it down per piece. And then if you choose CIF, and the I here signifies insurance, that means on top of the transportation, you also take out the insurance to the benefit of the buyer, of course, but it's your cost. That cost will be incorporated into the overall product price as well. So there are a few things that we will need to consider, and we're going to go through these terms one by one. So don't fret, we're going to talk about that in more detail. Now, before we do that, there's one more thing, or a couple of more things that we need to basically talk about when we talk about Incoterms. How to use it correctly. There's a common misconception that Incoterms are the three-letter codes. That's not entirely true. If you would like to state the Incoterm correctly for a certain shipment or goods, it contains three elements: the three-letter code, the delivery place, and the version. So just saying FCA means absolutely nothing. You could say FCA London, it's better, but it's still not good enough. FCA London Incoterms 2020, it contains all three elements, technically correct, but we need to be a bit careful with the place of delivery when we describe it. So in this case, if you look at the screen, the examples, the first one says FCA London Incoterms 2020. All three elements are listed: the three-letter code, the place of delivery, and the version of the Incoterms. However, if you're familiar with London, it's not exactly a tiny village, right? So if you as the seller shipping this out of London Heathrow, and God forbid, your carrier delivers the shipment to a different airport because they misunderstood. If your Incoterms is set as FCA London Incoterms 2020, well, you may have actually been complied when you delivered it to a different airport in London, even though it's not the right one. It pays off to be very specific when you set the Incoterm for a certain shipment to make sure that there's no ambiguity involved. You could go further, FCA London Terminal. So it's not just London in any kind of place in London, it's a terminal, but again, it would be probably best to specify which terminal in London because, you know, there could be several, even in London Heathrow, there could be several terminals within that. The more specific you can be, the better. If you have to deliver to a certain shop or place, you could even put in the exact address into the Incoterm to be absolutely specific. You might have the question, we have been asked the question, what is the best Incoterms to use? Well, there's no such thing as the perfect Incoterms. There's only the right Incoterm that is right for your business and your trade. What Incoterm would be more suitable than others, it depends on different factors, really. Imagine if you are a seller, for example, you're selling something, and let's say that you have your own fleet of trucks. It might be worthwhile to actually offer to do the pre-carriage for the buyer because, you know, you could offer some really favorable conditions, better rates, because you control the flow of goods, the trucks. Or if you have access to really low rates in the local market, you might use this to your advantage. So you might be offering the Incoterms that maybe include that kind of responsibility and cost for you, and it could work for you. Or you could be a buyer, and maybe it's a new company. You're not really familiar with the supply chains. You don't really have the volumes to have the power to get really low rates. So you actually would like the seller to take care of that. So in that case, you might opt for the type of Incoterms, which would put more obligation on the seller and less obligation on the buyer, but it's going to be a little bit more expensive for you because obviously all the transportation and other elements are going to be included in the price. So like I said, there's no one size fits all. It really depends on where you are and how you conduct your business. And then you need to pick the right one that suits that shipment or that particular trade the best. Okay, so with all this general things, let's have a look at the grouping of our Incoterms. First, we're going to talk about the 7 Incoterms that apply for all modes of transport. So you can use them for air, ocean, road, and they are applicable, no problem. And in the second part of our webinar, we're going to talk about the 4 Incoterms that are only applicable for sea or inland waterway transportation. So this is what we are going to do. With that said, let's start reviewing the all modes of transportation. And by the end of this part, we're going to do a little bit of quiz to change things up. So pay attention, okay? We're going to do a bit of quiz. No worries, there's no exam, anything. It's just some fun at the end of this part. So let's have a look at Ex Works. This is the very first Incoterm in the book. And this has the least amount of responsibility for the seller. It's a very popular Incoterm, and it's also not without risk, I have to say. If you look at the flow chart, you can see that the flow of shipment is signified by these icons, you know, the process that we reviewed on the previous slide, how the shipment moves through a supply chain. And the red part is going to signify the obligations of the seller, and the blue part will be the buyer. So if you can see, blue is definitely a dominant color on this slide, implying that the buyer's obligation is the highest. In terms of Ex Works, the seller doesn't really have to do anything else other than presenting the goods ready for collection at their chosen place. The seller does not have to do export customs clearance either. Could be problematic for the buyer. If you don't have representation in that particular origin country to do export clearance on your behalf, this could be a problematic point for you. Also, the seller is not obligated to load the shipment for you. All they have to do is present the shipment, and the buyer will have to take care of the loading. Now, what if the seller says, okay, I'm going to load this for you to make things easier. So they're going to load the truck for you at their premises. What could happen if there's an accident? And let's say that your warehouse worker drops the pallet on the floor. Whose problem is it going to be? Is it going to be the problem of the seller, or is it going to be the problem of the buyer? Interesting. And I can see an answer in the chat, and you are absolutely correct. It's going to be the buyer's problem, not the seller's. So that's something to be aware of. According to Incoterms, it's going to be the buyer's problem. It doesn't matter who made the mistake or made the error. That's what I meant when I said Ex Works is not without risk. Now, there might be a better option. Now, what is that better option? FCA could be an option for you. FCA is a fairly new-ish Incoterm. It was created back in 2010 with the specific purpose of addressing the risk factors of Ex Works. So it does address the customs clearance part, and in FCA, the seller does the export customs clearance, which is fair enough, right? I mean, they are in that country at that origin. They already have likely contact to the local customs authorities. The customs system is known to them. It's easier for them. And the shipper or the seller also needs to load the shipment. So these are two risk areas covered. The FCA term also allows the seller not just to load or do the export clearance. If they would like to, they can also offer pre-carriage to a certain place of delivery. That is also an option, and it depends on the setup or the seller, of course, but it's an option. Now, that might be a good opportunity for me to talk about a little bit about what this named place of delivery actually means. It's not to be confused with destination. That is could be a very different place. The named place of delivery here signifies the place of the risk transfer. So in this case, wherever, if the seller hands over the goods at their premises, they're just going to load the buyer's vehicle, then it could be their location. Or if they say, okay, I'm going to bring this to XYZ warehouse or to this handling agent, then it could be the port or airport or a depot. So this is the place where the risk transfers from the seller to the buyer, not the destination necessarily. Two different things, okay? So that's important to call out. There's one more thing that I would like to mention, which is part of the 2020 version. There is an option with FCA if you are moving shipments under letter of credit and you moving shipments via ocean, there is an option called onboard notation. And what it basically says that if you are handling payment through a letter of credit, typically the bank will require the seller to present proof of the shipment being moved and the seller completing their obligations by requesting a transportation document, typically a bill of lading. Now, what the problem could be for the seller in terms of FCA, that they are actually not responsible for the transportation, for the main transportation, like the ocean carrier. That is the responsibility of the buyer. Yet, to prove the letter of credit terms, they have to get the bill of lading. In that case, the buyer could use the onboard notation version of the FCA by requesting their carrier to issue a copy of the bill of lading to the seller so they can deal that, hand it to the bank, and they get payment. Typically, the carrier would, because it says onboard notation, that means that the carrier will only issue this after confirmed on board, which could be a week or two even after the seller handed over the shipment. So there's still a bit of delay, and the carrier cannot be obliged to do that, even if the buyer asks them to do that. So this option exists. However, in terms of getting the document, there could be some time involved from the moment the seller handed it over and the shipment actually departed with the carrier. A lot of times, especially I've seen this in Asia, this is why an FCR is typically issued now. We talked about the abbreviation. Here's another one for you. FCR, which is the Forwarder's Cargo Receipt. This document is typically issued when you work with a freight forwarder and you as the seller delivered the goods to the freight forwarder as nominated by the buyer. And this document replaces pretty much the bill of lading for you, because this is issued by the freight forwarder confirming that you did hand over the shipment in good order, no damage, no nothing. You paid your costs, you completed your obligation. And technically, if you ship via FCA, you don't really need the bill of lading because the carrier is not your responsibility. So that's another option. If you deal with international trade, FCR is fairly widely used in Asia, and some locations in Europe also favor that. Okay, so this is about FCA. So it could be a good option if you use Xworks, but you don't like the risk areas that Xworks presents for you. Now we're going to transfer over to the next Incoterms, which is now a C type of Incoterms. And you can see by looking at the arrows on this slide that the colors slightly shifted. So there's more red now than blue, and also some of the red arrows are longer than others. That's because this is the first Incoterm in the book where the risk and the cost transferred at different time and place. So in CPT, the seller is responsible for arranging for the main type of transportation to the main destination. So that's going to be their cost implication. However, the risk is transferring at a different point. The risk, as you can see, the second arrow, is going to be transferred much earlier at origin, at the named place of delivery. So let's say if you are a seller, you are selling, like I'm based in Ireland, so let's say I'm shipping this via ocean to the United States. And I'm going to use CPT, I'm shipping this to New York. That's going to be my destination. But my named place of delivery is going to be Dublin Port. So that means that the risk is going to transfer from me to my buyer at Dublin Port when I delivered the shipment to Dublin Port. Now, why could this be a problem? If anything happens with that shipment while it's in transit from the port to destination, whose problem is it going to be? I arrange for the transportation with my freight forwarder, my carrier, but the risk is transferring at origin. So if anything happens on the way to New York, my buyer will have to deal with that, according to the Incoterms. Now, why could this be problematic? Poor buyer, they did not arrange for transportation. They might not have relationship or contact with that freight forwarder, yet they are the ones who have to pick up the pieces and sort out the issue if there's a damage or anything in transit. So that's something to keep in mind when you are basically negotiating sales contract that involve C-type terms. The risk and the cost will transfer at different points. Something to consider. Okay, so let's have a look at a different version of CPT, CIP. And the only difference between CPT and CIP is that CIP also includes insurance on top of the transportation. The seller in this case will have to take out an insurance policy to the benefit of the buyer. So if anything happens in transit, the buyer will benefit and they get paid according to the insurance policy. Now, according to the 2020 version of Incoterms, the terms of the insurance have changed. Previously, the seller only had to take out a clause C type of insurance, which is a lower level of insurance than clause A, which is now a requirement according to the 2020 version. I don't know how many of you are familiar with clause C and clause A type of insurance. To put it in simple terms, think about your car insurance, comprehensive car insurance versus third-party insurance. There's a lot less things that the third-party insurance would cover. Comprehensive would cover quite a bit. To be exact, if you look at this table, it highlights a couple of things that clause A will cover what C will not. If you look at the red areas, that is what clause C would not cover, but clause A will. For example, earthquake or malicious damage. So somebody purposefully damages your shipment, or if any theft occurs, clause C would not cover it, but clause A will. Now, there's one thing that neither clause A nor C will cover, that's war risk, except piracy. So that's one thing that is not covered, but everything else is pretty much covered by clause A. Now, you might think, wait a second, why are we talking about insurance at all? I mean, the carrier has their own insurance. Surely, if anything happens to my cargo, they will cover the damage, right? Well, not quite. There is a limitation to liability when we talk about carriers. I mean, otherwise, if you have really high value goods, if there wasn't any limitation of liability, the carriers would charge you far more than they do to carry those goods, or they wouldn't take them at all. If you ship goods that are worth millions, carriers might not be that keen to handle those if they have to be responsible for the full extent of the value of the goods. This is where insurance comes in. Without insurance, there's a limitation that depends on the modes of transport that is being used. For air, for example, you can see the terms and conditions, you know, the small print, usually on the back of the air label. And in paragraph 4, you will see what the limitation on the carrier is. It's determined as 21 special drawing rights. Now, what the heck is special drawing rights, you might be asking. SDR, or special drawing rights, is an artificial currency. Think of like Bitcoin. You know, it was created, and SDR is basically made up of the 5 most stable currencies in the world currently. So these are the US dollar, the euro, the British pound, Japanese yen, and the Chinese yuan. Basing SDR on the most stable currencies mean that when they say the limitation is 21 special drawing rights, it pretty much stays around the same value, regardless of how the word changes. If you want to kind of exchange 21 SDR, it's roughly around 20-25 euro per kilo. So let's put that into perspective a little bit, shall we? Let's say you have one pallet weighing 100 kilos, okay? make math a little bit simple. So you have 100 kilos and let's say you have some tech goods there. So your shipment is worth 30,000 euros. Fair enough, right? Now, let's see that the carrier, when they were handling the pallet, they drop the pallet from a height and the entire pallet is destroyed. You cannot salvage any of it. You have lost 30,000 euro in goods plus the cost that you already occurred. Insurance, you don't have insurance, but you have transportation costs. According to the carrier, since the entire shipment is destroyed, you are entitled to 21 special drawing rights per kilo, which is for 100 kilo is 2,100 SDR, roughly 2,500 euros. But your goods are worth 30K. So you can easily say that you'll be out of pocket for about 27,000 euros if you don't have cargo insurance. If you have cargo insurance, you might be covered for the entire value of the goods plus transportation costs. So it's something worth considering. Now, what's the story when we ship by ocean? Also, look at the small print of your bill of lading or seaway bill. And you may find that if you are shipping in containers, you are entitled to $500 per container. Amazing, right? If you have goods loaded in that container worth $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 or more, if the entire container is destroyed, you get $500 in return from the carrier. Not a good option. So in this case, cargo insurance is definitely advised. So that much about whether or not you should consider insuring your cargo. Now we're going to transfer, still within the same group, we're still at all modes, to the D group. The first Incoterm is DAP, which is delivered at place. As you can see, the distribution of blue and red on the screen, that this is giving the seller more obligation than the buyer. So the seller is going to arrange the export clearance, they're going to arrange for the main transportation, they're also going to arrange for the delivery to the consignee's designated location. What they're not going to be responsible for is the import customs clearance. That is still the responsibility of the buyer. And they're also not paying any local import duties or import taxes. That is on the buyer. Everything else is going to be taken care of by the seller. The seller also does not have to offload the shipment when it's delivered to the consignee's location. Okay? So that's also one thing that the buyer will need to take into consideration. As you can see, the risk and costs here transfers again at the same point. Unlike C-type terms, the D-type terms transfer at the same point in time. So this could be advantageous for the buyer because they don't have to worry about arranging transportation. Yes, the product price is going to be slightly more, but it's less hassle for them. On the other hand, if you're using D terms, you also lose control of the transportation part because it's in the control of the seller. They make the contact with the carrier or freight forwarder. And if anything happens, you need to go through typically through the seller to get information on where your shipment is and what's happening. So it's a give and take. If you prefer to control more how your shipment moves, you might likely to use an F type of term. But if you're happy with the service and happy with the seller taking control, the D type term might work for you. Now, a version of the D-type term is DPU, which is a new term according to Incoterms 2020. And this is a very specific term where the seller also responsible for offloading the goods at the consignee location. Now you might wonder, why on earth would I want to do that as a seller? It's just more hassle for me. Now, this is for very specific situations. For example, we don't have an image about that, but you can probably imagine, let's say that you're a hospital and you have just ordered some very expensive MRI machine or state-of-the-art surgical machine. Now, when that shipment arrives at the premises, likely you don't have staff specialized in, offloading that type of machine, bringing it up to the third floor of the hospital and installing it. As a seller, however, since you probably manufacture this, or at least have very detailed knowledge about how to deal with this, you probably know this, and you have staff, dedicated staff. So in that case, the seller, to mitigate the risk and damage to the goods not being delivered without damage, they can take this upon themselves to make sure that the goods arrive properly and they are installed properly. So this kind of situation could warrant using a DPU type of term. The same, everything else is the same, so the buyer is going to take care of the import clearance, all import duties and taxes, but they're not going to be responsible for offloading the shipment when it arrives. And now, the last term in this group is DDP, which is very popular with, when Amazon was introduced all those years ago, this is the model that they started using, which is really great, for e-commerce. All you have to do is, putting the goods in your basket and it's going to be delivered to you. You don't have to deal with anything else, just waiting for the shipment to arrive. As the buyer, you really don't have to move a finger. Pretty much everything is the responsibility of the seller. They arrange any export clearances necessary, the transportation from for the main part and also for the delivery. They also have to do the import customs clearance at the destination, and they will pay any import duties and taxes. They're going to deliver it, and the buyer will have to offload the shipment, and that's the only obligation they have. Now, it's great, again, if you don't mind the shipper having control over the transportation bit, but it could also present some issues for the seller. For example, if you don't have representation in that foreign country, you might have issues conducting an import customs clearance on your behalf. A lot of countries require that you are actually registered in that country as an importer of record. So you might need to work around that issue to be able to use DDP in certain countries. Okay, so now here's the time for a bit of fun, okay? We're going to do a little bit of quiz just to make sure that we kind of remember or understand what each Incoterm means. So I'm going to show you a scenario, and then I'm going to ask my helpers to put a poll on the screen where you can basically just say who's responsible, the seller or the buyer. And then we're going to give you some time, 20 seconds. Don't overthink it, okay? So just think about a little bit, and then whatever pops into your head, choose the answer, submit the poll, and then we see what the results are, okay? So here's the first one. While loading goods at the seller's premises, there was an accident. The terms were X works. Who is responsible for damages? So we're going to give you some time. So there was an accident while the goods were loaded at the seller's premises. The agreed terms were X works. Who is responsible for the damages? I'm going to give you a few more seconds. Don't overthink it. Okay, I think we are good to reveal. Okay. It's a really high 81% says it's the buyer. And those of you who chose the buyer, you were absolutely right. Yes, because when you use X works, the seller is not obligated to load the shipment. If they do, but if anything happens, it's still going to be the buyer's problem, because according to Incoterms, the seller is not responsible for that. Well done. Here's another one for you. Goods arrived in Frankfurt via air freight. The delivery truck crashed on the way to the delivery address. Who is responsible for damages if DPU terms were agreed upon? Is it the buyer? Is it the seller? So the delivery truck crashed on the way to the delivery place. Who is responsible for damages if DPU terms were agreed upon? Going to give it a few more seconds. And okay, let's reveal the outcome. A lot of you, 86% of you, thought that it would be the seller. And you're right, because we're using D-type terms, the seller is responsible not just for the main transportation, but also for the delivery. In case of DPU, they will be also responsible for the offloading at the consignee's premises. Think about those hospital scenarios and expensive MRI machines. That's where DPU comes in handy. Very good. Let's have another scenario. On the way to ABC warehouse, the place of destination, the delivery truck crashed again. If we were following DAP terms, who would be responsible for the damages? Again, similar scenario. Our delivery truck crashed on the way to the destination point. If DAP was used, who is responsible for the damages? The buyer or the seller? Going to give you a few more seconds to consider. Okay. Let's see the answers. Similar breakout. 85% said it's the seller and 15% said it was the buyer. And those of you who chose the seller were absolutely spot on. In terms of DAP, the seller will be responsible for the final mile delivery as well. So if this truck crashed on the way to that point, that is still going to be the seller's problem. Very good. Okay, I think we have more. Hopefully you're not bored. Okay, how about this one? A vessel sinks in the Indian Ocean on its way to Jeddah. The agreed terms for FCA. Who is responsible, the buyer or the seller? So a vessel sinks in the Indian Ocean while it's on its way to Jeddah. The agreed terms for FCA. Who will be picking up the pieces after this, the buyer or the seller? Remember, FCA was the newish Incoterm that was addressing the risk factors of X works. And I think we might be ready to reveal the answers. Very similar split. 87% of you thinks it's the buyer and 13% thinks it's the seller. So in this case, it is the buyer. So FCA means that the seller is responsible for loading or maybe for the pre-carriage, but for the main transportation, it's definitely the buyer's responsibility. So if this container was on that vessel that you can see in the picture, that is going to be the buyer's problem to deal with that. Very good. Now, what do you think about this one? A container was sucked into the jet engine on a shipment heading to London. The agreed terms were DDP. Who is responsible? The container was sucked into the jet engine on a shipment heading to London. The agreed terms were DDP. Who is responsible? Remember, DDP stands for Delivery Duty Paid. One of the D terms. Okay. I think we might be ready to reveal the answers. Let's see them. Oh, wow. This is the, we are getting into the 90% now. 96% of you thinks that it's the seller's problem, and 4% of you thought it was the buyer. Under DDP, it is the seller's problem. They are responsible for pretty much everything except the offloading at destination. So indeed, this is going to be the seller's problem to deal with. Very good. We have one more. Let's see what you say about this one. A plane from Dallas, Texas crashed upon landing at London Heathrow, damaging the freight inside. Well, that's not a pretty sight. The agreed terms were CPT. Who is responsible for the damage, to deal with the damage? So this plane departed from Dallas and it crashed upon landing at London Heathrow. The freight was damaged. If the terms were CPT, who will be responsible for the damages, settling the damages, buyer or the seller? Remember, this is a C term, which means that the risk and the cost transfers at different place and time. I'm going to give you a couple of more seconds. And very shortly, here's the answer. Oh, that's a nice split. 67 versus 33. Okay. So in terms of CPT, the cost, the seller is indeed responsible for paying for the main transportation up to London. However, the risk is going to be transferred at origin, at the origin port or airport, which in this case would have been likely Dallas, Fort Worth, if that's the airport. So if this baby gets damaged upon landing, that is very much going to be the problem of the buyer at that stage. Even though they didn't pay for the transportation, the risk transferred earlier. So all 67% of you were absolutely spot on. Well done. So that was the last quiz in this section. And now we're going to transfer to the second part of our webinar. It's going to be much shorter because we only have 4 terms that belong to this group, which is the sea and inland waterways. Hope you're ready for this one. The first one in our group is FAS, which stands for Free Alongside Ship. This term, as you can see on the flow chart, is an F term again, which means that the risk and the cost transfers at the same place at origin. This type of Incoterm is very specific. It's not suitable for containerized freight. It's only for bulky type of freight, and FAS specifically used for out-of-gauge type of cargo, project cargo. For example, this one. Look at these massive pipes on the right side of the picture. These are the type of pipes that will be loaded directly on board of the vessel. So when the shipper has this kind of goods, they will deliver these pipes or goods right alongside the vessel that is going to carry them. So that's where the shipper will have to, or the seller will have to deliver them. Or look at this type of cargo. I'm curious if you know what this is. Any idea what's in the picture? You could put it in the chat if you have a idea. You guys are very, very knowledgeable. Wow, I can see a lot of answers all around the same. Exactly. So this is a blade of those, machines that create the electricity for windmill. Yes, exactly. As you can see, it's pretty big and likely out of gauge. So these would be also type of goods that will be delivered alongside the vessel if it's transported via ocean. Let me go back a little bit to the Incoterm slide. So the seller will be responsible for doing the export clearance and deliver the goods to the side of the vessel. And again, this is not an Incoterm that would be used typically for containerized freight, because the shipper will never be allowed to deliver a container alongside the quay. So that's a different type of movement. Okay, let's move along to the next one. And I would be very surprised if you didn't hear about this one. FOB, aka free on board. It's a very popular Incoterm for a reason. And may I say also probably the most misused Incoterm of all time. Now, why am I saying that? FOB is not to be used for containerized freight. Exactly. You might be wondering, but why? Well, a couple of reasons for that. FOB, a lot of people, as they understand, it's about all the shippers paying all the origin fees, and the buyer is going to take care of the main transportation and the destination cost. And that's pretty much true. The problem is with the transfer of risk, because under FOB, the seller is obligated to deliver the goods on board of the vessel. However, when we talk about containerized freight, that is something that the seller will not be able to do. They cannot deliver the container on the quay, on the board of the vessel. That's not how containerized freight moves through the terminals. So that is a big problem. There would be probably a better Incoterm to use instead, most likely FCA, if you would like to be careful about that. Because you might say, okay, we've been using FOB for containerized freight for 10 years, no problem. It works until there's an issue, and there could be issues. Maybe, let me give you an example. A couple of years back, during the pandemic period, when ocean freight soared, the cost of the containerized moves just soared from $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 to up to $20,000 per box. Pretty steep. There was also a massive issue with space. Containers might have been rolled for a week or two. So you, as the seller, for example, delivered your container to the terminal, done and dusted, I did what I had to do. You do not arrange booking with the carrier. It's the buyer's problem, right? So let's say that the carrier couldn't move the container on the booked voyage. It remained in the terminal. It was rolled. And it still didn't move on the next vessel because there was another problem. It was rolled again. What you started accumulating at the terminal is demurrage. Because, the warehouse to the terminal is not a charity organization. They're going to ask you to pay for the space that you occupy, even if it's not your fault that the container hasn't been lifted. Now, here's the problem. Who's going to pay for that demurrage, right? The seller's obligation ends when the container is delivered on board of the vessel. So technically, it's their problem. However, as a seller, hey, I'm not responsible for the carrier. I did not contract them. It's not my fault that they did not uplift the container. Here's exactly the conundrum that you might have to worry about if you use FOB for containerized freight. There was another semi-famous scenario that actually went to court because the seller and the buyer couldn't settle it between themselves. So imagine this scenario. Containerized freight again. The container was brought to the quay because it was ready to be loaded. It was lifted by the crane to be brought on board of the vessel. Now, there was a problem with the crane, and as the container was moving in the air over the vessel to be placed on board of the vessel, the crane dropped the container. So the container never got on the board of the shipment. As it was falling down, the container hit the railing of the vessel, and then it ended up in the sea. The argument started, who's responsible? And the seller said, hey, I delivered it on board of the vessel. It was above the vessel board, but it was on board. The buyer disagreed. He said, no, the container never arrived on board. You're going to be paid for the damages. So at the end of the day, the case went to court, and the court ruled that because the container hit the internal railing of the vessel on its way down to the sea, that actually could be considered as fulfillment of the FOB term. So the buyer had to pick up the pieces and pay for the results of the accident. Fair or not fair? This was the ruling, and this is why it's important to be very specific and to make sure that we all understand what the term entails. Because incidents like this could become very, very expensive when we have to kind of engage lawyers, court fees and everything else. It just, and not to mention the relationship that it's going to, the impact on the relationship with your trade partner. So that's something to consider if you use FOB. Okay, moving on to the last couple of Incoterms in this group, CFR, which stands for cost and freight. This is again for bulk type of freight, not for containerized freight. And in a true fashion of the C term, the risk and the cost will transfer at different places. The cost is going to transfer at destination. The seller is responsible for arranging for the main type of transportation up to the destination. However, the risk is going to transfer when the goods are loaded on board of the vessel at origin. The seller will again do the export clearance, and the import clearance will be taken care of by the buyer. Now there's one more, CIF, which is a version of the CFR term, and the only difference is that in this case, the seller also has to take out cargo insurance for the benefit of the buyer. However, in this case, it's not clause A type of insurance. For this case, it's still clause C type of insurance, so the lower level of insurance for CIF. Now, if it's agreed, the seller can take out a clause A type insurance. There's no problem with going above the regulations as long as both parties agree and it's stated in the sales contract. But the requirement, according to Incoterms, is C type only. Everything else is the same as CFR. The risk transferred at origin on board of the vessel, and the cost transfers at the main port of destination. Let's do a little bit of quiz, okay? Just to make sure that we understand these last four Incoterms. So you know the drill. We're going to show you a scenario, and then we're going to show you a quick poll where you can vote for the buyer or the seller, and then we're going to reveal what the answer is, okay? Hope you're ready. Let's see. A ship runs aground from China to Los Angeles. The buyer and the seller agrees on FAS, free alongside ship terms. Who is responsible for any damage that occurs? Okay. And you might see that this is a containerized ship, which is not exactly the scenario for FAS. In case you noticed, you're absolutely right. We should have put some big pipes there or wind turbines. That would have probably more appropriate. So who is responsible, the buyer or the seller? I think we are ready to close the poll and reveal the answers. Okay, a fair percentage of you said it's the buyer's problem, 84%, and 16% said it is seller. So this vessel ran aground while it was in the main transportation mode from China to LA, and according to FAS, it is the buyer's responsibility to arrange the main transportation. The shipper is delivering the goods alongside the ship at origin. That's where their obligations end. Okay, very well done, all 84% of you. Let's have another example. And this case, freight began to fall off the vessel and was damaged at the port of destination. Who is responsible if CIF terms were agreed upon? So it's another C term, and remember, the cost and risk will transfer at different point and time. So this shipment fell off the vessel at the port of destination. If we talk CIF, who will be responsible for the damage? The buyer or the seller? Okay, let's give it another few seconds. And okay, that's a different kind of split, 60-40, interesting. So 60% of you think it's the buyer and 40% said it's the seller. So in terms of CIF, yes, the seller has to pay for the main transportation, but the risk is going to transfer at the place of delivery at origin, which is typically the origin port. So if anything happens, from that point onwards, the responsibility lies with the buyer, even though they didn't arrange for the transportation for that bit. Well done, guys. Okay, so I think we might have one more, maybe two more. There was an explosion on board of a vessel traveling from Portugal to the United States. The agreed terms were FOB, free on board. Who is responsible? The buyer or the seller? So there was a problem on the vessel on its way from Portugal to the USA. We agreed FOB. Who is going to be responsible? The buyer or the seller? I'm going to give it a couple of more seconds. All right. Closing the poll now. Let's see. All right. 87% thinks it's the buyer. 13% thinks it's a seller. So in terms of FOB, the buyer is going to be arranging for the main transportation, and they're going to bear the cost for it as well. So this vessel had a problem during that main transportation between the origin and the destination. Hence, who voted for the buyer? They absolutely right. Well done. It is indeed the buyer's problem. Let's see if we have one more. We don't. So that was the quiz. Thank you very much for playing along with us. And before we close this webinar, I would just like to do a quick recap, do an overview of what we covered over the last hour or so. A few points that I'd like to highlight as key message. So Incoterms is not legally binding unless you put it in the sales contract. So the sales contract is not obsolete in any way. There's a lot of things that Incoterms does address, and there's a few things that they don't. So make sure that you reference Incoterms properly in your sales contract. And it does not just mean the 3-letter code. You need the 3-letter code, you need the place of delivery, and the version of the Incoterms to make this complete. And please be as specific as possible to avoid any kind of ambiguity when dealing with your trade partner. You need to be absolutely sure that you both understand the same thing, the same obligations under the terms. Be very mindful that the place of delivery and the destination may or may not be the same place. Okay, so remember, the place of delivery signifies where the risk transfers from the seller to the buyer, but the place of destination could be a different place entirely. Incoterms will address the obligations of the buyer and the seller and the risk transfer between the two parties. It does not address the transfer of ownership or payment. That is very much still in the sales contract. That is something that needs to be addressed there. And I think these are probably the main points. If you'd like to use previous versions of Incoterms, you can absolutely do that, as long as you reference them in your contract as well when you add the version number to your Incoterms. And with that said, I'm going to hand this over to David and Ellie to give you information about the handout and all the other resources that we have for you. Thank you very much for your attention. I really hope that you found this webinar beneficial. Thank you. Over to you, David.
No, thank you, Christina. I definitely learned a lot there. I know we had a couple of questions around in the chat around slides and things like that. As mentioned at the start, due to the intellectual property around the content, we can't send the slides out and we don't record the sessions. If you need more information, we will be sending out a short survey after this session. And if you complete it, you'll be redirected to a link where you can download this handout. On top of that, if you do need anything else, reach out to your Expeditors contact, whether that be your account manager, the person in sales that you're currently talking to, or just anyone, myself, Ellie, Christina, will be able to direct you to the right place to make sure you can get a follow-up on anything that you need. But yeah, there will be a survey. They are really useful to us. We usually base all of our webinars for the coming year on that, and finding out what you guys want to hear and what you guys want to learn and have information on is really beneficial for us to make sure that the sessions are as useful as they can be. Just a little bit on other ways you can stay up to date with things at Expeditors. As I mentioned at the start, there was a QR code. If you scan these QR codes, they're going to take you to a web page which will allow you to sign up to various news updates from Expeditors, whether that be our Horizon Brief, specifically from myself, the UK and Ireland newsletter, or currently with all of the things going on in the Middle East, our Operational Impact Update, which is sending out regular updates on both ocean and air markets out of the Middle East. That one's right at the bottom of the page, so if you do want that as well, make sure you scroll all the way down to the bottom and select that. If you sign up to that, that will make sure you're looped in on any any materials that we send out. If we just flip over, one final thing from me, just to stay up to date with all other events that we have at Expeditors. Ellie is just about to pop something in the chat. Yes, she has done. That's great. That is our Expeditors LinkedIn events page. That will keep you up to date with all events across Expeditors, not just in Europe, but across the globe. So if that's US customs updates, whether that's webinars from our partners at Onyx, who are doing webinars on Iran and the conflict over there and how the market is changing on a daily basis, do make sure you check those out. I know there's a couple of questions still in the chat I have a couple of minutes. I'm sure the team have a couple of minutes if needed, just to sort through those last couple of questions. If you have anything else, please drop them in there, and we'll try and work through them quickly. If you have any questions on any of the content, please fill out the survey, and we'll make sure we get back to you through your Expeditors contact as well. And once we're through with those questions, I'd like to say, once again, thank you for attending. Thank you to Christina, Michael, who's done a brilliant job. We've had a lot of questions, and we've definitely been inundated, and he's definitely had to work hard this morning. But no, thank you for participating. Thank you to Ellie and Bridget for help facilitate this webinar. And we'll just answer those questions, and then after that, feel free to leave. And I hope you have a good rest of the day and a good rest of the week. But yeah, as we work through those, we'll keep the session open for a few moments just to make sure we catch any questions that we need to. But other than that, yeah, we hope to see you on our next session. Thank you.
I can see the stream of emojis coming up. This is amazing. You're amazing, guys. Thank you so much. We're so glad to see that you found this of value and beneficial.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina, for hosting. We hope that it was useful for everyone. And obviously, as we move through the year, we'll hope to host another session as well. So if any of your colleagues would find this useful, when we push the invitations out again, make sure you pass it on to them. We're always willing to run sessions that can help our customers across the market. I think there's just one or two questions that Michael is still working through. And I think there was one or two questions as well that we couldn't specifically answer on the session. We'll look through these as a team, and we'll make sure we get the message out to everyone as to specific answers, or if we can't answer it due to it being too specific. As Christina mentioned, we can't advise as to which Incoterm is best for you, but we can advise you as to what the Incoterms that you suggest would mean. Then yes, we can work from there. But other than that, just from me, thank you very much. I think that is all. But yeah, no, thank you.